And welcome once again to Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific? Brought to you by our producer, IEJ Media, our sponsor, Bauer Group Asia. I'm Ray Powell. I'm the former military officer. I'm coming to you from California, and over there is Jim Carouso. He's the former diplomat, coming to you from Arizona. Jim, how are you?
I am well, and I'm very pleased that you've migrated again away from military to economic issues.
Well, once in a while, we have to sort of go to the boring stuff. No, this is going to be a very exciting podcast. Sorry. No, yes, totally exciting. I am so into this. so,
You are so
well,
sad.
well, to make it even more exciting, we've got with us Dr. Alvin Camba. He's a sociologist with a PhD from Johns Hopkins. He studies Southeast Asian political economies and their relations with China, as well as critical mineral supply chains. So, more to the point, he is the author of a article over on the New America website entitled "The Jakarta Model is No Blueprint," in which he argues that Indonesia's policy of banning nickel imports and incentivizing domestic refining, while it has boosted the economy and positioned it as a key player in global electric vehicle battery supply chains, it has come at a severe human and environmental cost. So, Alvin, it's great to see you again. But what is the Jakarta model, and why should our audience care whether it's a blueprint for anything?
Yeah, that sounds good. Ray, Jim, thanks for having me. So the Jakarta model is it's a combination of different policies, but the most important policy behind the Jakarta model is something called the export ban. What the export ban is if you have mining companies in the country, instead of mining companies being able to export their resources, their extracted resources overseas, the Indonesian government, or the government in this case, has effectively inhibited them from selling those resources overseas. They have to sell domestically. What it effectively does is it forces refining and smelting companies to actually domesticate and invest in the host country, in this particular case, Indonesia, which is in some ways it's good for development. It's industrial policy. It expands value chain upgrading and sort of the value captured by the Indonesian government and the society in this particular case. Now, that there are, as I argued in the article, there are many, many bad things about it, in as much as there are good things. Why should we care? Well, many countries in the world are trying to copy it. People have said this is a successful model of industrialization, of industrial policy. But as what I argued, there are many bad things.
All right, let's get into it. And this policy has been in effect for more than 10 years. I started with copper and gold, as I recall. And the idea was to add value. Why export raw material? Let's go up the value chain, as you said. What
Yep.
are the bad things? What are the negative aspects that you found?
Well, so just a couple of things. So there are a lot in the article, but like a couple of things. Now, in terms of like what starts it is that there is an export ban, right, that stops like domestic mining companies from selling overseas. That means the market, sort of like the buyers of their resources or the buyers of their extracted minerals, would now be inhibited, would now be limited to a small number of refining companies or smelting companies. This is what we call an oligopsony, wherein buyers have, I would say, purchasing power, have the power to push down the prices because there's not a lot of them. It's not going to be a free market. It's not going to be dictated by top hundreds of or even tens and dozens of mining companies. It's going to be down to like 4, 5, 10 refining companies. So if you have a set price, if the refining and smelting companies are able to dictate the price, it results in what I call a race to the bottom amongst the mining companies, because they're gonna keep on digging for more resources. They're gonna bypass all the environmental laws. They're gonna hire more cheap labor, and that leads to, I would say, many bad things: environmental degradation. You have air pollution. You have, let's say, water waste, etc. You have the expansion of, you have land grabs happening all over the country just to expand like mineral concessions for these mining companies. And more important, and another dimension of that is that if refining and smelting companies build their refineries, they build their infrastructure, those create a lot of environmental harms as well. You have air pollution, you have acid like leakage that's happening all over the place. Asthma and cancer rates are basically up in these parts of Indonesia since like 2019.
Let me just follow up. Originally, the Indonesian government was encouraging the mining companies, which tended to be some multinationals, to build their own smelters domestically.
Yeah.
So it'd be one company selling to another local company. And then the government's argument was, and we'll get the value add from the refined material that's
Yeah.
exported. Did that not work?
It worked in the sense that you do the gov so it worked in my sense. What I've argued is that it worked, but alongside with it working, you have a lot of environmental and social costs as well. The government does make a lot more money. In 2013 and 2014, for the total amount of refined goods, so in nickel, there are two types of refined goods. It would be refined nickel and pig nickel iron. The total amount that the Indonesian government gained from that in 2013 was $3 billion. In 2024, 2025, it's now 10 times that price. I'm sorry, that amount of money. It's now 30 to $40 billion. So it worked. But the what led it to work would be all these bad things that I basically outlined in the article. It necessitated all of those things. It needed those things for it to actually work.
Okay, so let's go back here and think about just from from the raw materials, the rare earths, to a critical mineral. We know that there's this refining process that is super messy,
Yeah.
and it's one of the reasons that we don't see a whole bunch of refining happening in, say, the developed world, is because people don't want that stuff. They don't want all of those bad things to happen in their neighborhoods, and they have ways to stop it. And so what ends up happening is it gets pushed into the developing world. And governments like Jakarta say, you know what? We're just we're willing to take that risk. Because we need the capital. We're a developing country. We have to have capital. So what is the alternative? Is there a way for a country to have a Jakarta model that's not so dirty, frankly?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer. So in some ways, they also did the same thing in Indonesia. Like, we don't want smelting and refining in the developed world, so we have very little here. We're trying to expand them right now. This is what our government is doing. In Indonesia, they did not build smelting and refining in places where you have a lot of Indonesians, where you have the majority population. Instead they built these places in supposedly relatively uninhabited areas in the eastern parts of the country. You're looking at Sulawesi, Kalimantan, Maluku area, etc. So in some ways, they try to avoid the harm that you've basically said, but like, it is very difficult. It's- I mean, it's very difficult in the sense that the country has to slow down, and the country has to properly pick places where you could actually build this like sort of this like infrastructure without creating too much harm. They did not do that. It was all about like, let's build this fast, let's build this quick, let's get as much money as possible, let's create as many jobs as possible, regardless of what happens. um they also like disempowered their environmental ministry that would have like checked, and that would have like sort of like stopped many of these companies. And the other thing is, local governments were effectively co-opted in the process. You have the centralization of power under Jokowi, and that basically pushed out local government in terms of like participation, in terms of their ability to reject projects. So in a sense, if a country were to copy this, it needs to slow down. It needs to properly pick projects. It needs to have consultation. It needs to have a strong environmental ministry. It needs to have strong local governments. There is a cost there, obviously, economic gain. Like, that would be the cost. But in terms of how Indonesia did it, fast and quick, relatively speaking, it hasn't really been good.
So again, when this was all being discussed in Indonesia, there was a big nationalist surge. These are Indonesian resources being exploited by foreign powers, some of them former colonial powers. So this is a national enterprise, and it had a lot of public support. So is that public support still there?
In many ways, it is still there, despite the cost. There are scandals against, when Jokowi left the government. He still was relatively popular in many ways. The same with, and now with Prabowo, there are some scandals, but in many ways, the scandals are not about sort of like these issues. It's about like something else. It's about all the other things happening in the Prabowo government. Um, I I would argue the reason why you still have strong public support for, I would say, these projects is it goes back to what I said. They built these projects in places where you don't have the majority population living in those places. These are minority ethnic groups in the eastern part of Indonesia. This is not Java. This is not Sumatra. This is like in the relatively insulated places of the country. You still have obviously hundreds of thousands to millions of people. Indonesia, Indonesia is a very big country of like 250, 60 million people, but majority of like Indonesians have benefited from this. You have like hundreds of thousands of jobs being created. The fastest economic growth in Indonesia happened in the eastern part of the country, precisely where you have these developments going on. So they're able to sustain support despite the harms happening. I'd argue this sustainment of support might decrease in the future as these harms expand over time and as these harms become more visible.
So, along with that, are they making improvements to these processing facilities to reduce the harms? I mean, has there been progress in the actual environmental performance of these plants?
Not from so people I've worked with in Indonesia. So two organizations. One is Jatam, the other is Nugal. So they're both environmental NGOs, and they consistently check up on these places. They do interviews locally, and I work with them in terms of many on a bunch of different projects. Um, in their assessment, and I've talked to them about it. I would say a few months ago when I published this article. There really hasn't been any improvements done on many of this like on these facilities. And the reason for that is it's hard to improve. It's hard to improve once you build a refinery that costs like I would say hundreds of millions of dollars, and you build this like in this industrial park as well. It's very hard to improve it. It's very hard to improve sort of the technology behind it. It's very hard to offset the cost that has happened. That would cost a lot of money for these companies, for the Chinese company involved as well. So they haven't really done a lot of it. I think what's been happening rather than improving these facilities is that they've been trying to cover these things up. Some of these NGOs that I've worked with, they've been harassed by, I would say, state forces, not in the ways that endanger, not in direct ways that it endangers their lives, but flimsy cases, sort of like this, like they get sued by the mining companies. Then they have to appear in court, and there's like legal harassment going on against like some of these NGOs. So there is a cover up, at least from the part of the mining companies, from the part of the local government, and there's a need to expand public discussion and public discourse about these things in order to get to that, I would say, state of improvement that you mentioned a while ago.
So these refineries and smelters, highly capital intensive, highly energy intensive. Margins tend to be thin and depend on commodity prices globally. So who owns these smelters and refiners?
So the smelters and the refineries are under the jurisdiction of it's a mix. Mostly it's a mix. It's a combination of Chinese and Indonesian joint ventures altogether. Majority of the shares are owned by the Chinese, but you have this like joint ventures between Chinese companies and Indonesian mining companies. It's usually a consortium of, I would say, a consortium of, let's say, a couple of like Chinese companies, and then you have a couple of Indonesian companies. Many of these Indonesian companies are connected to the major political parties and the major political actors in Indonesia right now. So you do have this, I would say, consortium of these companies. It is capital intensive, as what you said. It is, however, profitable despite, I would say, mineral prices like sort of like constantly going up and down. It is profitable precisely because they've been able to vertically integrate many of these facilities in an industrial park. It is now concentrated. So one of the big issues why Indonesia, Jim, you're totally right. They've been trying to do this since the 1980s, encourage domestic mining companies to expand smelting and refining. But it's very expensive, and the capacity of Indonesian banks to lend money to Indonesian mining companies wasn't very high. So when they invited these Chinese companies to come in, you have a surge of Chinese capital that went in the country, and they were able to expand. They created this like vertically integrated industrial parks. They expanded very quickly. They expanded very strongly, and they're able to maintain profits, Jim, precisely because they basically push down. mining companies in terms of, let's say, the price that they are expecting these mining companies to sort of sell their goods, their extracted resources. So they sell internationally. They sell an international price that is profitable. Even if that goes down, they basically just push down their purchasing price, um, undercutting these mining companies, and then these companies are then forced to do bad things in order to keep up with their production.
Okay, so bad things. Let's take us inside one of these industrial parks. I mean, if we went there, presumably in a hazmat suit, what would we see? I mean, what would be happening there? How does how do these harms actually get transmitted, one to the workers and then to the surrounding communities? What is it, in the water? Is it in the air? Is it in the soil? How is this happening?
Sure. So it's a bit of both. So one is the industrial park, Ray. You're completely right. I've been to a couple of these parks. It is super impressive, like, if I could be honest. You're looking at, they have an airport, they have like a actual port inside the park. You have a 5-star hotel for the investors, which is like, and the hotel itself has like a helicopter pad for like for fancy people like flying in from the different islands. They just take the helicopter, right? Then it's fascinating. You see thousands of workers in their motorcycles, like going inside the park every day, or sometimes they park outside the park and then they walk inside. Then you have a mixture of, let's say, Chinese workers who usually stay inside the park, and Indonesian workers who basically commute from somewhere else. Many of these Indonesian workers don't even belong to this area. They actually are drawn from all over the country. You have engineers from Java, who are usually the highly educated people in Sumatra. They go to these places. Then you have workers from literally all over the country going there, because the park itself is an impressive, I would say, industrial sort of achievement. Um, in Sulawesi, the only advanced and working clinic in Morowali, in that area, actually is paid for by the park, and the parks itself have they sponsored a school for kids, basically like secondary education. If you're uh if you're an Indonesian in that particular like area, then you want to get in work in the park. You want to work in the park, right? Then you study in that school for free. After 2 3 years, you basically become part of like the park itself as a worker. You can become a you can take up basic functions in there, working as part of, I would say, the production chain. So you do have these positive parts about it. Now the negative parts, um, the park itself is one thing, but the park itself is not the only source of environmental damage. You have, as I said a while ago, mining companies operating, I would say, in a substandard way, because they had tried to keep up with the pricing that is imposed by the parks. You go outside the park, you sort of see the areas affected by the park. You see mineral tailings all over the place. You see, even in the areas surrounding the park, you have like landfills, like literally they're digging through across like different like forests and areas. You have land grabs happening wherein people in the kampung or the villages are getting pushed out. You have like environmental dumping that happens across like the different lakes and the different areas across Indonesia, because these are offsets, basically. These are the outcomes of the mining operations happening. Mining operations need these things. They continue to dig, they open up areas, and then they basically take out they dump their pollution, they harvest like trees, and they basically move people across places. Now inside the park, it's a bit more, I would say, it's a bit more tame. You do have the big refineries and the big facilities. That's where they bring in the extracted resources that they buy or that they get somewhere else, and then they smelt it inside the park. But then the smelters themselves are environmentally like damaging. You have like air pollution all over the place, that comes from the smelting process. You have the refining process as well creates a lot of environmental tailing damage, which is consistently dumped in the lakes and the sort of like the rivers of those areas. And then when workers themselves have to work so much, you're literally looking at like 6 to 7 day work weeks where they have to work 10 to 12 hours. And if they get fired, the Indonesia, the parks themselves can actually get new workers anyway, because there's a lot of demand for people to work in these places because of the huge unemployment that exists in the country. So I would say those are sort of like Those are sort of like what you can see from like air and water pollution from the nickel refining process. In Kalimantan, quickly they have the open bauxite mines, and if you're familiar with bauxite, it's a very like radioactively like problematic process. They create red mud from the aluminum process that occurs. Like when you smelt aluminum per se, the byproduct is there's a byproduct of red mud. So you sort of see this like the red mud like literally dump in different places in Kalimantan. So this is happening across like two big islands.
So my understanding is Indonesia actually has pretty strict environmental laws and regulations. So is this a matter of the Environment Ministry not having the resources to enforce it? Is it corruption? Is it the fact that, as you said, politically connected companies are involved? What's the problem?
It's all of it. Many of these projects are considered to be NSP national strategic projects by the Jokowi government. That means they were able to expedite the projects, and that means they were able to operate with limited, I would say, government scrutiny of these operations. And then the other part of it is the environmental ministry has been undercut since I think 2020, and I cited it in the article in terms of like the powers of the ministry being weakened by some of the laws that were passed by the Indonesian government. The other big thing is that many of the contributors of the political parties are joint venture partners of the Chinese companies in these parks. So you have a combination of these things: the regulation, political party connections, and I would say the weakened environmental ministry.
Okay, so now, but it has become known internationally among some as the Jakarta model, which implies that other countries are looking to copy this model. And I think you named some that are actually down in Africa.
Yeah.
So, it first of all, their motivation, I would assume, is the same, which is they want essentially capital that the government can bring in. Um, is there any sense that they're, from these other countries, these African countries, or are there others in Southeast Asia, that there are harms that come with this?
Um, do you mean like are these countries aware that that the Jakarta model has been problematic? Is that it?
Yes.
I don't see that sense from at least when I talk to people in the government. I was in a New America. So again, I don't do fieldwork in Africa, so I don't really know this, and I'm very much connected in Southeast Asia, so I'm more familiar. But my sense of the governments there is that they might have a sense, but they're not telling people about these problems. And I think it goes back to the fact that they want their own refineries, their own smelters, their own processing facilities to be built in their countries. So I think some of the countries I mentioned would be Namibia. Namibia praised like Indonesia's ability to ban raw material exports and build its own refineries. Nigeria did the same thing. They reference Indonesia, and you have Zimbabwe as well. When I spoke to like people who are members of African NGOs, they basically said that no, the governments want to push it, but we're not hearing, we're not seeing that the government actually wants to have I would say a good discussion about it, a cautioned way of implementing refineries and smelting. They want to copy Indonesia and sort of the Jakarta model. In Southeast Asia, it's pretty much the same. I mean, Ray, you know that you and I work in the Philippines. I mean, the Philippine government wanted to copy it as well, at least in terms of discourse. My sense is that there really hasn't been, although the government has been hampered, the Philippine government has also been hampered by its own bureaucratic like hurdles and issues right now. So there hasn't been a lot of momentum there. But when this came out, and I would say a year or two ago, they wanted to copy it, and there were a couple of references about it. Um, Other Southeast Asian countries are sort of like much less willing to sort of like copy this model. They have a different developmental model. Vietnam, Malaysia, and Thailand are a lot stronger in manufacturing. You do have some, I would say, whispers of rare earth investments in Malaysia and other places, but rare earths are very different. Rare earths operate in a very like smaller scale than I would say critical resources such as nickel and lithium. So I would say that Malaysia right now and Vietnam are focusing on getting rare earth investments rather than refining. Although I wouldn't be surprised if they want to do the same thing.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned rare earths because my understanding is the reason rare earths got concentrated in China was because the refining and smelting process is so dirty. Everyone else in the world is happy to say, you China wants to do it, you go for it. We'll just buy the output. So is it your expectation now that there's this worldwide scramble for rare earths resources, can it be done in other countries and not create environmental damage?
I think, yeah, that's a difficult question to answer, but the reason why, so you are completely right. Rare earths concentrate, rare earths, um, became concentrated in the PRC when in the 1980s, etc. When we were globalizing our companies and a lot of American companies went overseas and we let go of our refining smelting capacity. That included rare earths. Mountain Pass MP Materials in California used to be a historical company that did this. In the 90s, they lost in the competition against Chinese companies because it was much cheaper and you can pollute heavily and people can die and nobody will bat an eye, right? In China, back in even right now, I would argue. Um, the Chinese advantage is a combination both of, as what you said, it's dirty, they're willing to accept it. But the other reason is that we haven't really seen the sort of the conditions under which Western companies can reinvest in rare earths. So the difference between rare earths, I would say critical resources, is that it's actually very hard to find standalone, I would say, mineral concessions of rare earths. Rare earths are often, geologically speaking, a byproduct of, I would say, pre-existing mining concessions or like mineral tenements or mines per se. So if you let's say in Indonesia, if you basically extract nickel, a part of it or a percentage of it may be related to rare earths. It's very hard to find it, but in many ways, rare earths are basically a byproduct of, let's say, bigger mineral reserves and bigger sums of mineral reserves, etc. Now, the Chinese advantage is that they found standalone rare earth, I would say, facilities. They've developed it. And I think the other advantage is that since they dominate refining, when countries actually sell, I would say, minerals to China, we inevitably unintentionally sell rare earths as well, which they could actually process. Now, if we develop our own refining capacity and if we have a lot of like incentives, financially speaking, at the same time do it properly, then I believe that the West can do the same thing. And perhaps there will still be environmental damage, but sometimes these things are inevitable.
Okay, well, so now you've really, kind of come to the heart of the question from the Western perspective is, how do we compete, right? How when we've got the problem with critical minerals and rare earths has been one, of course, is that China has got decades of a head start essentially in sort of developing the industry. But the other thing is that our expectations, our laws, our regulations around environmental issues are just a lot more strictly enforced. And that seems to be the major barrier when it comes to figuring out how do we do this either ourselves or maybe through our friends. What is the way forward? How do you see that working out? Can we actually do it ourselves, or is it just too dirty and expensive?
I don't. So I would push. I would reframe it a little bit, Ray. I don't think the environmental issues are sort of like they are one reason. I don't think that's the biggest reason why we are not able or we haven't been doing it in the past 30, 40 years. The reason why we haven't been able to do it or we've moved away from doing it is because it's so much cheaper to get from the PRC than develop it domestically. The market incentives haven't been there in the past, like since the 1980s and 1990s. Because if you're a manufacturing company or you're a refining company, why would you even compete with China when they could actually they can make it cheaper, people can die, and that they can look the other way. You probably won't get sued in like a state or federal government, and they vertically integrated these facilities. Now that was in a period of interdependence, or I would say globalization, back in the 80s and the 90s, when the PRC and the United States have a better relationship. In the condition right now, where you have, I would say, a bifurcating global economy, an increasingly clear yet gradual separation between the United States and China in terms of, let's say, many parts of the economy. That includes semiconductors, that includes critical resources and rare earths, that includes drones, for instance, UAVs and UUVs. I would argue that when we start creating these market advantages, this sort of like calculus for Western companies to invest in rare earths and critical resources, both in the extraction of minerals and at the same time the refining of them, then I would say we can begin to blunt the advantages of the PRC. In other words, we haven't really seen we're not yet in the condition where it's profitable for Western companies to do it. But when we get there, I would say we can actually catch up and blunt some of their advantages. The reality is, it is much more profitable for a Western investor to put money in an AI company, such as where I work right now, rather than a refining company or a mining company, because it takes a long time to sort of like build these things. You might deal with cases, you might get sued by the local community. But if you have financial incentives and if the government will back you up, then we can actually get there.
Well, so what we're seeing now is China basically threatened to withhold exports of rare earths. We don't have sufficient supply in the West. So we have a 1-year truce. Is 1 year long enough for Western companies to develop this supply chain to replace China, or what happens after 1 year?
It takes a longer time than so a couple of things, right? I think number one, it does take a long time to sort of like I would say catch up. I would argue so in the short term, I don't think it's a major issue because of two things. Number one, we have reserves. Many of these companies have REE reserves, including the United States. Um, Rare earths are crucial not for the construction of, I would say, particular vehicles. Let's say a drone, for instance. Rare earths are necessary for, I would say, enhancing the functionality of many of these like tools and like weapons. So, for instance, anti-heating material for missiles, or let's say you want to make the drone more efficient, then you need rare earths. We do have the inventory and supplies for it, at least in the short term. Now, in the medium run, that's when. And now, before I talk about the medium run, um, rare earth quantities are usually very small. We're not looking at, let's say, nickel or lithium or cobalt that you need a lot of it to produce a battery. Rare earths are usually very small in terms of, let's say, quantities mined and quantities used. So because it is small, there is enough inventory right now, at least in the short term, to sort of sustain Western production. In the medium term, that is when we can deal with, let's say, potential issues when it comes to, I would say, production of drones, production of, let's say, missiles that are more functional and more advanced, or let's say submarines. Um, we expect, at least optimistically speaking, I probably would take 3 to 5 years in order for some Western refineries to sort of come into power, and for these refineries to start refining for the Western market exclusively. So we're not there yet, but we might get there. Um, and I would even say for the PRC, it's not. I don't think they have the total advantage as well when it comes to sort of like rare earths. They're scared of one thing as well from the West. They're scared of the um the expanded semiconductor ban that basically led to them like using creating their own like export ban to impact like rare earths, like rare earths exports, right? We have our own leverage as well. And the 1 year standoff, I would argue, if they decide to sort of like reassert their rare earth ban, we could reassert our own semiconductor ban in terms of strengthening it. The 1 year BIS rule that we also agreed to withhold. So it's a standoff and it's a truce, and I don't expect these things to change anytime soon.
All right, let's get you out of here on this. So, we've talked before in other podcasts. We've talked about fishing and the, are there ways to package or to have expectations for fishing that when the consumer buys something, Jim will talk about getting his dolphin safe tuna, right? Is there that there's something that the consumer knows about the supply chain for how he gets this fish that tells the consumer that this was actually produced in an environmentally unsound way, or one that violates someone's human rights or something. If every electric vehicle, for example, came with a country of origin story around its nickel or its critical minerals, what is it? One sight, one sound, one smell from one of these processing areas that you'd want buyers to experience before they buy their Tesla?
Sorry, do you mind explaining your question again? What do you mean by one sound and one
In other
smell?
words, if if there's something on the package that, whether that or something associated with the product that you would want the consumer to experience so that they know what the what the environmental or human cost of that product they were buying, let's say a Tesla or an electric vehicle, what would that be? What would you want people to experience? Again, sight, sound, smell, whatever it is, just so that they get the impact of buying this electric vehicle battery or whatever communicated directly to them.
Are we talking about I mean, I know you're talking about certification.
I'm
I'm
not
sorry, I
talking
kind
about
of,
certification. I'm talking about the effect
you're
on the
not
consumer. If I buy a can of tuna and I know that
right.
20 dolphins were sacrificed so that they could produce this tuna, and I like dolphins, what are things that electric vehicle purchasers should know about where their batteries come from and the process of producing them? What would you want them to know?
I want them to know, is this like, did it, so very concretely, did this come from like, was this produced alongside with true violating human rights? I think a big issue with the batteries right now would be are you familiar with the UFLAP, right? The
No.
Xinjiang exclusion list. So there is a list of companies that is in the exclusion list of the American government. In many ways, many of these companies operate in Xinjiang, and you have like Xinjiang slave labor and basically the displacement and the cultural genocide that's happening to basically those those populations, right? A lot of the batteries that are produced in China and a lot of the minerals actually come from these places. We've yet to sort of implement this wholesale, and we've haphazardly implemented this. So I mean, first and foremost, this is like one super clear thing for me that consumers need to know or slash experience if they're gonna buy a Tesla or etc. I'm sorry, I couldn't get your. I have a problem with this question because I'm not super sure about experience and sounds, but I think there are many things that we're doing in the West that we could do better.
Yeah.
And there are things we're doing right. That includes the UFLAP list. Unfortunately, supply chains are very opaque and very dark. They're very, very difficult to trace. There are a lot of ways in which companies circumvent certifications, circumvent restrictions, circumvent, let's say, guidelines. And this is what in my firm, this is what we're doing. We're trying to like illuminate the dark supply chains in the global economy in order for consumers and companies in the United States and the West to know what they're exactly buying and under what conditions do these people get it from.
Great. Thank you. Dr. Alvin Camba, we do thank you for joining us. This has been a really illuminating discussion. We hope to have you back.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. Thanks, Jim. Have a good day.
And once again, our sponsor is Bauer Group Asia, a strategic advisory firm that specializes in the Indo-Pacific. Bauer Group applies unmatched expertise and experience to help clients navigate the world's most complex and dynamic markets. I keep doing that. I spend way too much time in the Philippines. Dynamic markets. My co-host Jim Carouso is a senior advisor with Bauer Group, and you can visit their website at bauergroupasia.com. Well, Jim, I mean, we're back into your wheelhouse. You know this topic so much better than I do. And so it's of endless sort of interest to me because I'm still trying to unpack all of the differences and I mean, even just between rare earths and critical minerals and all of that. And so I appreciate all of these people who come in and bring us their insights, but I'm especially interested in this Jakarta model. And I think you have some specific experience with that.
I did. I was posted in Jakarta as the economic counselor at the U.S. Embassy at the time when Indonesia was applying the export ban on things like copper and gold exports, which had a significant U.S. investment, as well as nickel. And the issue was that, as I mentioned, building a new smelter is really expensive. There's overcapacity in the world at the time, at least for copper and gold smelting. So why build a new facility when you already have invested in other facilities? And also, as we used to discuss, Australia was digging dirt out of the ground and shipping it to China, just dirt that they'd refine into iron. And they were making them in. So we kept saying, why do you want to do this? And it's all about appearances of moving up the value chain, industrializing. and because they saw what uh, pure nickel sold for versus the dirt.
Well, I
That
mean, it
makes
sounds like there are people in Indonesia making good money off of this, and it might even be economically pretty significant in terms of bringing capital into the country.
well, it was. It brought a lot of capital in the country because China was industrializing like crazy, right? They needed new smelting capacity anyway. Um, the companies were subsidized by the Chinese government because they wanted to have influence over Indonesian government as much as they could. These joint ventures with Indonesian companies were a way of achieving that influence, and also because they wanted to assure their supply chains. China doesn't have all of its own nickel. Here's a way to have an assured supply that they controlled from the mine to the smelting to the end user. So it was you can understand how it all worked out.
Well, so do you get the impression that the problem with the Jakarta model is in concept or in execution? I mean, was it a bad idea, or has it just been executed in ways that need to be improved on?
Well, I used to say that government industrial policy doesn't usually work well, but now we're from a country that has its own industrial policy. So what can we say? We're bringing on shore things like rare earths manufacturing and all sorts of other manufacturing required to be done here. So industrial policy is very much of the moment, whether it works or not. As I mentioned to Alvin, Indonesia actually has pretty good environmental laws. The problem, as in many other things in Indonesia, the laws applied on a ad hoc basis, we'll say.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a real problem. So I will tell you a story now because it pertains to this.
All right.
So I visited one mine owned by an Indonesian company, and it was awful. And they were mining copper and gold, and the way they were refining the gold was they had big piles of the ore onto which they poured arsenic, which would leach the gold out. And supposedly they were holding the arsenic that leached out into pools that they collected. Yeah, not so much.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, another American company had the biggest copper and gold mine in Indonesia, one of the biggest in the world. And they spent a lot of money trying to make sure they were clean. Now, there were a lot of tailings, the leftover from when they crushed the rock and they poured it into a river. And the river delta now was this huge thing that extended out to sea from all the stuff they dumped in the river. But they insisted it was clean. And they proved this by planting thousands of palm trees and other crops to show, look, it can't be that dirty. All this stuff is growing. Same country, same environmental laws. One has higher costs than the other.
So, what happened to the palm trees? I mean, were they growing? Did they look good?
They were, yeah. At least the ones they showed me were growing. Maybe they had other ones that are all dead, but they look pretty happy. And also, as Alvin was saying, these facilities are amazing in the middle of the jungle, luxury hotels, clean water, which you can't always get even in the capital. Great housing, at least for the foreign executives, but even the local workers had pretty good housing. So it's an amazing infrastructure needed to support these facilities in the middle of nowhere. I have no idea what the new investment is doing in that regard.
Oh. Well, I mean, yeah, it just sounds like a really tough one. Again, I don't know if there's a model for how you do this successfully in the developing world. Um, I'd love to hear what it is. I mean, if the Jakarta model is not the way to go, uh, is there a way to go? Is there another model that exists out there? Because I haven't heard one yet.
Well, it gets back to if the environmental and labor laws were implemented, maybe it'd be okay.
Yeah, maybe, or maybe they would all just shift production to some other place and where it's
Well,
cheaper and less environmentally.
that's possible. It's also just in passing, Indonesia is now trying to move up the value chain further and say, all right, do you mind the nickel here? You should build the batteries here.
Well,
And once you have the batteries here, you should build the Tesla here.
I mean, that's sort of the way things happen in China in a lot of ways, right? They bring it all together in one place, and that's how they manage to really sort of keep their costs low and make a lot of money.
Yeah. And, Indonesia has as Alvin said, about 260 million people. A big chunk of them are under the age of 30. They need jobs.
Yeah. Well, somebody who's at the top of our value chain is Ian Ellis Jones, our producer, and his
He's a
company.
rare mineral.
What?
He's a rare mineral.
He is a critical mineral to us. And IEJ Media, he of course produces all of those military and geopolitical graphics you love so much. You're following him, if you're smart, on X at Ian Ellis Jones. And of course, if you enjoyed this episode, you should just subscribe and follow. If you were subscribed already and you were following us, you would have known that we would have already produced a couple of different kinds of critical mineral podcasts, because this is such an important topic in the Indo-Pacific. So you can get that if you're subscribed to us on YouTube at IP Podcast. You can do it if you're subscribed up on your mobile device, on your favorite audio podcast service, or if you're following us on social media, on LinkedIn or X, or now Facebook, our newest entree into the social media world. You can follow us. If you're following us on any of those, then you'll keep up with all of our latest podcasts. And of course, if you want to communicate directly to us, Indo-Pacific Podcast@gmail.com. That's Indo-Pacific Podcast at gmail.com. So nice, I said it twice. And finally, please follow our sponsor, BauerGroupAsia.com. We really appreciate their support. BauerGroupAsia.com. Tell them that we sent you. Finally, for Jim and Ian, I'm Ray. Thanks for joining us this time, and join us again next time on Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific?